Hello, testing. Good morning, everybody. 9 a.m. on a Wednesday. Thank you guys so much for coming. Really appreciate it. Especially given that it's we aim to pick something that wasn't the norm on the conference agenda to specifically kind of provoke and inspire and kind of try to shift some mindsets about how we're thinking about entrepreneurship and investment going forward. Not just BHP itself and the company that I represent myself, but as a sort of global collaborative community of entrepreneurial interest. So, quick disclaimer, as always with BHP, there's so much legalese. Opinions are those of the author presenter only, always bear that in mind, and I'm not trying to sell you anything or get you to buy our stock, don't worry. And then a quick, who am I? Hi, it's really nice to meet you. I'm Ash. I'm a tech anthropologist and engineer, specifically multimodal diagnostic, and a recovering venture capitalist and archaeologist. My sort of long-running career specialty, because I'm way older than I look sometimes, is the past, present, and future of technology and how large organizations can move things forward faster. And so I've worked on that, building systems, corralling very strange large groups like the Vatican and different royal families and different governments into what they can be doing to shift their innovation and venture practices and investment practices to kind of build entrepreneurial communities around some of these new technologies. And before joining BHP was the senior tech lead for the CIA's venture capital arm, InQtel. But as you can see now, I'm with BHP, which is one of the world's leading mining companies, and it does seem like a strange forum for me to lean into, but it's part of my thesis of a major shift that's happening in industry and government and finance and who's funding the next realm of technology, who's going to be pushing those boundaries forward, who can push those boundaries forward. Because when we're talking about just de-risking disruptive technology, ultimately, there's always historically been four sources of primary science and technology funding. You have that aristocratic patronage, which used to play out as sort of the Medici family, the nobles, things like that. Now we have our billionaires and things along those lines. You have the government in various forms, who really, for most of the 20th century, were really, really leading the charge with investment in R&D and pushing forward on what we would be building as a species. And then for the last 40 or so years, venture capital has really, really taken the foreground with respect to them being the leaders of, okay, we see this coming, we're going to invest in it, we're going to yield these big returns. And industry has kind of been sitting there chilling the whole time. Occasionally, when it crosses over with the military-industrial complex, gets super involved with the government side, but really, it's mostly been content to sit back and watch what happens. However, with everything going on these days, and apologies, my throat died yesterday, and I was like, how am I going to go on stage? But it bounced back enough to at least do this. But between recent geopolitical shifts, funding shifts, different ideological shifts in different countries, and as well as kind of a more conservative mindset, what we're seeing is government tamping down on long-term science and technology investment. It's very contractual basis, even with the large-scale national labs. Groups like CSRO, the National Science Foundation, they're more and more reliant on contractual science obligations. They're asking people, hey, will you give us money and you tell us what you want us to build? Meanwhile, venture capital is getting more and more risk adverse. They want to get their LPs money. They want to turn that around. So they're investing more often in quick returns and things along those lines, which has left, to a certain extent, the billionaires playing in a lot of the hey, what's the future? How can we invest in this? Which means if anybody's going to balance it out, this is when industry, who again has hitherto kind of just been watching, is going to have to take a bigger seat at the table and actually talk and actually kind of pay a bit more attention to what's going on and what they need and what can shape that. Typically, in the wonderful world of corporate anthropology and organizational psychology, That kind of thinking is done in strategy groups, in innovation groups within the company. For instance, I'm in BHP's innovation group, is where they've sat me. We were originally in innovation ventures. But it comes with a lot of risk when companies set up those kind of groups, because the language associated with it is really scary. Moonshot. It's what everyone always says to me, like, oh, like this is the moonshot department for PHP. But here's the thing with the moonshot. The moon, specifically, like humanity going to the moon, was a very, very well calculated, very deliberate, strategic effort. It wasn't just happenstance. It wasn't just, hey, this is kind of cool, let's do this. It was decided upon, and the steps were created to move us in that direction. But for whatever reason, more and more when corporate innovation groups are kind of challenged to like, okay, how can we get a beat on disruptive technology? How can we support that? There's a shy away. There's a conservatism of, oh no, we can only like do more step change pieces. And yet, realistically, in the history of corporations as a concept, which is arguably relatively brief in the scope of human history, again, anthropology, archaeology hat, the companies that balance it out actually keep going. Most companies don't make it to their 200th birthday. The ones in the last century that have kept going and have made it to that mark and keep going do so because they evolve. They balance out that portfolio of super long distance planning and short-term ROI that they need to have on the table. They get over their fear of moonshots and they figure out how to strategically do better, more clever investing in the future, and kind of widgeting around how they're going to get the technologies they need for their industry. And that's what we're up to at BHP right now, is figuring that out. However, a lot of that is, oh, that's very pale, apologies. A lot of that is getting people comfortable with these recipes, right? These recipes that we know as a species. We can look back at everything we've done, all the technology we've developed over thousands and thousands of years, and we can say, okay, here's been a really good recipe for success. When you put people in this situation with this kind of backing, with this kind of mindset, they will make something. You can't always guarantee what it's going to be, but they will make something. And the problem is, many of those kind of systems now, they either get shoved into Western post-industrial norms of work life, or we set them up to be something separate, and then we break them. So universities, for instance, beautiful idea. We need those, definitely. And yet, right now, our universities, our professors are struggling under publish and perish. The grad students are underpaid and underfunded to get anything done of their own research, let alone their professors' research. Everybody's scrambling for funding. They're not actually pushing forward on new ideas. And then you have the extra add-on of often that funding comes with the clause of, well, if you accept this funding, you have to work on X. Not the thing that you think is interesting, that you think there's potential behind. So universities, we built them up to be something apart from traditional 9-to-5 work, so we could have these powerhouses of future research and industry, and yet we've kind of broken them. Same thing with skunk works, which if you're not familiar, I'm going to term loosely as essentially a government or industry attempt to basically create a research lab, a free-for-all kind of zone where people can theoretically follow their passions in the same way we set up the universities, except now it's at a professional level. Now it's outside the university. The notion was that these things will get commercialized faster. And in the era post-World War II, these were incredibly, incredibly amazing. They kept the science and technology going for a little bit without the wartime footing. And it was great. It wasn't always as socially appropriate as it could have been. It wasn't always for good, but it was a great idea. But now, a skunk works. It's not really doing that same thing anymore. You have a lot of them at major companies around the world. Different governments have different little kind of mini labs set up, and with the exception of various things they've done in Israel, not many of them are actually pushing out technology, let alone faster, into commercialized spaces, even into government hands. It tends to go back to that same widget, that same short-term ROI concept. So it's just not as useful. So again, we set up this thing to break the 9-to-5 post-industrial norm that stops us from innovating, and yet we broke the thing we built to innovate. This third category that historically we know is a recipe for disruptive tech, the mad scientist in the garage. This works. There's actually some crazy stats, which I apologize, have entirely forgotten and not included in my notes, about how often some of the really, really craziest, juiciest things of the last century was someone in their garage. We all know some of the early Silicon Valley stories, but even some of the hardware systems, windshield wipers, was a random housewife. Like these stories of where the tech come from, when it's that individual who had an idea, who had an itch for something, or was really frustrated about something. That's often kind of something that will get people moving, is if they run into some weird little point of like extreme frustration, then they will move forward on that. But this is, again, something that society doesn't super encourage, right? We have to have basically some form of what I'm going to call a 9-to-5 job in order to survive, in order to feed our family. Maslow's hierarchy of needs of food and housing and security, you have to find something else that will enable those. You can't go straight to mad scientists to fund your basic existence or that of your family, which means you don't have time to be a mad scientist in the garage. Most of us get home at the end of the day, we're pretty tired. Like, there's not that much energy left to then turn around and go build something and go experiment and go beat your head against like the 80 times it's going to fail before you get to the one that works. So again, we have even this archetypal figure in our pop culture, but we don't actually let people be that very often. Now this is a trivia question for the group. Can you guys guess? Can anybody have any ideas of what is the most innovative job group in human history to date? Entrepreneur. It's a very specific role, and this group was set up, and over the course of 150 or so years before they changed their policies, they filed the most patents in the most fields, and the pieces of technology that they've established basically set the stage for everything we have around us today. Any guesses? Was it? Electricians. That'd be cool. Mine, oh, well, that would be theme appropriate, right, for BHP? Alas, no, although there is some really cool innovation history in mining, even in like the super, super ancient world. It's actually the Anglican priesthood. So I know, right? It's such a weird thing, but it's the Anglican priesthood was like, if you chat it all up, because think about what their job role was. It's relatively kind of low-key religion, because let's not forget, it's basically Henry VIII being like, I want to be divorced. You Catholics, you won't let me? I'll make up my own slight version. Right? So it's kind of, Anglicans are always pretty cheery and pretty awesome about that. But it's a job role where usually it's the second or third son of a wealthy family is going to be the priest. You can get married if you want. You're given a house. Most churches came with a vicarage. Between your family and the surrounding community, they're taking care of food. And realistically, if you weren't even super into it, you're only working 1 to 2 hours a week on a Sunday, giving your sermon. A lot of them didn't even prep that. So hopefully they're doing some prep work during the week. But it gave all of these really bizarre academics an opportunity to play. And basically they followed that down different rabbit holes, all of them. Some of them focused on dog breeding and plant genetics and pushed in that direction. Some of them focused on some of the core pieces of the Industrial Revolution, on the engines and on the steam mechanisms and on early electricity. One of the other ones gave us one of the most powerful things that we leverage all around of it. So you have some of it in your pockets or purses. There's some of it on the screens down below here, although we don't have any windows. But that glass that we have everywhere that we can use, that was them. That was 2 of them. And one of their sons conveniently he put in to be an architect for the World's Fair in London at the turn of the last century, and he built this thing called the Crystal Palace, the first big building built out of glass, and the world came and was like, holy F, this is amazing. Like, we want this. How can we do this? It rapidly changed policy and laws all around the world because everyone had, at least in Europe, had followed suit with this sort of window tax notion. So everyone had tiny windows. I don't know if you've ever been in like a really old building, but they always have tiny windows. It's because they used to get taxed. And the glass was expensive. And it was it was letting out heat, so they just didn't do it. But here's this amazing glass, right? So this one group was given accidentally this really amazing recipe for success, but it wouldn't fit in today's society, right? Not the way we do things now. And that's kind of the issue, is that we kind of fall into these really weird logic traps sometimes with our own stuff. So even though we know these recipes of how to get innovators to really, really go crazy and in a great way, and to kind of turn what people would term moonshots or chaos into something very deliberate, whether within their own field or even, again, going back to that actual, where we get the term moonshot from, the actual moon race, we still don't do it. And I found that the same thing applies with just the notion of disruptive technology. Often when I talk to executives in big companies, they view disruptive technology, they're waiting for it as if it's a surprise. It's going to shock them. It's going to terrify them. But that's the thing, it's not a surprise, is it? It's an inevitability. We might not know exactly what it's going to be, although in many, many cases, I would say like 75% odds, we can make some really solid guesses based on the trajectory of technology over time. And really, more importantly, to the strange title we gave this presentation, we can look back at our own pop culture to say, well, what have humans wanted? What did we build our stories around? Be it science fiction of the modern era, or even earlier mythologies. These are essentially giant tech request lists. Because over and over again, these stories have described technology, and then, at least in this example, these are all modern era examples of the last like 150 years or so. In every single one of these, we ended up with these. Sometimes deliberately, sometimes accidentally. For instance, Jules Verne alone. This is just like the top of the pop for the more recognizable authors, right? Because if you run across the whole of every obscure science fiction genre, they have come up with so many more things that have just been part of our conversation later. The one that gets me, that I'm not included in this list though, are the conferences that they used to have in the 1920s about the internet. Like, think about that. They're trying to describe this thing. They have electricity, but it's not like it is today. Radio's just coming out, and they're sort of like, if only there was some way that everybody could be talking. What would that look like? What would the boundaries need to be? And so there's several conferences in the interwar period between World War I and World War II, where everybody is talking about these notions of systems and how are we going to organize all the world's information once we actually have a digital backbone to put it on. They didn't know to call it a digital backbone. They didn't know to call it digital. But here were these people who will never, maybe there's somebody who lived long enough from one of those conferences to touch a computer, but never in life they got to the technology they wanted, but they were describing it. And you can see that over and over again. It's trippy, right? Like the different things that people come up with, but that's the reason why they come up with them. They're essentially us saying, hey, this could be solved, or this will be an issue, right? This is what science fiction is. It's either dystopian or utopian, and either way, it's pointing us towards some really interesting guidelines of what we could be creating, but also how and where we ethically might want to watch our step once we do. Which, to be perfectly honest, with respect to a lot of the recent technology bursts, and everyone's there's a lot of AI panic still, and yet sci-fi's been AI panicking for years, right? Nobody took them seriously, and yet here we are. But the fun thing is, you can go back even farther, right? It's not just modern sci-fi. It's the mythology that came before us. Any storytelling that humanity has done over time has told us the story of what technologies we wish we had. And this is the kind of thing where I would love to see industry and entrepreneurs and governments looking more thoroughly through these lists, and rather than sort of waiting, apologies, waiting for something to miraculously appear, to say, oh wow, hey, wouldn't it be really cool if we had this thing that we wanted thousands of years ago? Let's build it. So I'm not going to bore you with all of these because I have a bajillion, but these are some of my favorites. So one of the more immediate ones, right? You have all the chariots of the gods. for thousands of years across nearly every culture around the world, right? The sun and the moon are usually some sort of vehicle, and the gods can fly across the sky. And then usually there's other subsidiary characters that find ways to fly. And then we built planes. We said it would be impossible, right? People laughed at Leonardo da Vinci when he first designed his attempts. And yet, hundreds of years later, there was a systematic contest at the turn of the last century to be like, well, wait, we can do this, let's do this, right? They put funding into it. They said, who's gonna beat this? And out of nowhere, rather than the favorites, the group sponsored by the Smithsonian, the group sponsored by all of the different the early car companies, the wagon companies, but you get the Wright brothers coming out of left field, being like, hey, we made a thing. It was a deliberate choice. They sort of were like, we're close enough, can we get farther? One that doesn't come up very often, and which I am very grateful to, there's an amazing professor at Stanford who's written a book called Gods and Robots, which I very highly recommend. Is this great breakdown of all of the AI and robotics in the ancient world. And one of the ones that really struck me, because it had never occurred to me, was the story of Pandora. Because Pandora is a robot, but you never think about it as such, but that's the story. It's actually in there. She's not a human, she's not a god. Basically, the gods are kind of pissy at Prometheus and his brother, and they wanna mess with them. So they're like, we'll build him the perfect wife. He won't be able to turn her down, and then we'll have her trick them into stuff. So they build this woman. Prometheus is too smart. He's like, nah, I'm good. But his brother, who's never the cleverest, he's like, yeah, I'll marry her. And they're like, cool, happy wedding present, here's a box. And that's the part of the story, remember, right? Pandora's box. Pandora opens the box and lets all of the evils out of the world to humanity. But at the beginning of the story, Hephaestus, the god of the forge, builds Pandora. She's a robot. And she's not the only one, at least not in Greco-Roman mythology. Hephaestus has a whole lab of fembots. He only gets invited to parties because he brings drones that serve the food. Like, it's weird when you go back and you read these things and you're like, oh my gosh, from the perspective of the stuff we have today, you can see them wishing for it. It's trippy. And then this bottom one, because this was one of my favorite concerted efforts, and I love thinking about the dudes who sat on the committee that made this happen. So this medieval image, well, actually no, let's make this another guess. Can you guess who the historical figure is who is meant to have the first submarine? Can we guess? Who had the first submarine? Who is it? What was the guess?
Who got swallowed by a whale?
Jonah, no. Literal submarine, like a device for going underwater. Legend has it was Alexander the Great. It was actually this really popular story that on his travels back from the East, that he essentially, either him alone or with a whole posse of people, traversed the bottom of the Indian Ocean and Red Sea on their way back in a submarine. And so it became this really, really popular meme, first in sort of peak of the Alexandrian library. Kind of there's this whole section where they first start writing science fiction. They write stories about everybody. So it's very popular then. And then in medieval literature, they pick it back up. And they're like, this is so cool. And so you have all of these medieval manuscripts that show Alexander in different designs for like a weird little submarine bell jar thing of varying size and scale. But here's the thing. That story could have faded into obscurity, right? This notion of under the sea, but it didn't. Because in the American Civil War, both sides were like, we need an edge. We need an edge. Does anybody have a crazy idea? And someone is like, well, I mean, Alexander the Great. He's like the greatest general the world ever knew. What did he do? What were his novel technologies? And they look back at this and they're like, oh, he had a submarine. I think it's at that point that they literally named it a submarine. And so the Confederates and the Union both started building submarines in the Civil War. This is the 1860s. They were not great. Like, they were clunky, they were heavy, they were wooden. Some of them killed a lot of people, but they got them into battle. And this one, the H.L. Hunley, like, straight up took out a whole line of defense. But this was like people thousands of years later from the story being like, oh, hey, we're pretty sure this ancient general had this thing. Let's make it now to win our war, right? And then from then onwards, you have the more, once it's sort of, they've talked it in, right? And made it like, oh yeah, no, it's the next great thing. You forget where it came from. You forget where the idea came from, right? And everybody just goes forth, and then we have all of these insane submarines that we have around the world today. I really encourage you, if as a kid you had like a favorite bit of mythology or something along those lines, look back at this story now that you're older and kind of pull apart, like, is there a piece of technology in there? Were they asking for something that they didn't have? Because that's the thing, we have this use list. We just have to strategically build it. Conveniently, post-World War II, there was a phenomenon that really pushed forward on how to shift this and how to actually start kind of pushing forward on this. This is a combination of features. Not only did the original Star Trek come out at a time where it was like widely broadcast, right? There were only a handful of channels. It became kind of low-key at first, gained steam over time, but really, really put that notion of science, it validated science fiction, not as just pulp novels that were read in like back garages, but as this medium that could be discussed, could be things that kids talk about, could stream about building. But it coincided really interestingly with this thing that was happening in the US, where post-World War II, there was a lot of concern that the science and technology development funding, the oomph, was ebbing really fast. So at the end of the war, like literally right at the end of the war, they were already worried about this. And so this amazing dude called Vannevar Bush, a rather amazing scholar, can't vouch for him personally, he put forward this thing called Science, the Endless Frontier, which you'll recognize as Space, the Endless Frontier, right? Where he basically was like, okay, here's how we're going to have to balance out long-term technology investment and short-term technology investment in the future. Here's how we're going to have to really, really be strategic about this and imaginative about this in order to keep things going if we don't want to just rest on our laurels. And every now and then it gets picked up by different presidents and put down. Obama's team actually had a really, really great revamp where they kind of pulled apart some pieces of where things have succeeded per Vannevar Bush's grand plan, where things had fallen short, etc. And they also get extra points because they actually timed it so that it would come out on, what's the date? The date in Back to the Future 2, where they go back to the future. So like they released it to time with another science fiction cadence to kind of attract this attention. But the end point is that right now we're not actually meeting this plan. We're not really meeting any plan because we don't have a plan, do we? Like it's kind of a bit of a free-for-all when realistically, given what we have these master problem sets in mythology and science fiction. We have so many interested parties who want to work forward on these things, and yet we're all working in our different silos. And this is part of one of the reasons why we wanted to put something out here today, was to make a push for greater strategic collaboration on all of these things, be it tech funding, tech piloting, but also like really targeting what are those pieces of future disruptive tech. Because sometimes they can be made to happen, they can be force functioned. Some of the things we get from Star Trek alone, video calls, smartphones, the cloaking devices the military straight up had named after Star Trek, and then the universal translator systems like Google Translate and things like that. Some of those were happenstance. They happened along the way. They popped up in other pieces of science fiction. Star Trek can't claim sole ownership over them, right? I mean, video calls alone, you have those in Back to the Future as well. Like they pops up pretty regularly. The Jetsons had video calls. It's something that we were looking at being like, this would be so amazing. Isn't this so great? And it's one of those things where already it seems ubiquitous, doesn't it? Right? Do you remember the world without video calls? It's only been a couple of years, but it already feels so strange. Do you remember the world without the smartphone? Without the GPS on your phone? Right? It already feels so crazy because it's literally so embedded in our lives. But what I encourage you to do is reach out to older members of your family or community. Listen to their stories of the technology shift, because it's crazy hearing it straight from of like how insane some of the things we carry around in our pockets seemed to them when they were little, right? They could have never dreamed of the smartphone, of the internet, of the video call. And yet we all have them. They see them all the time. It's a trip. But where we do have this opportunity, there's also a legacy of kind of half starts, right? Some pieces moving forward on these. Qualcomm and the X Prize have historically tried to push forward on the tricorder, at least the medical components of it. For those of you who are Trekkies, the tricorder is this handheld device. It morphs over time. It does pretty much everything. It can diagnose a human. It can diagnose the mineralogy in the surrounding rock. It can do some crazy, zany things. And there have been some pushes over time to specifically target that and make that thing that has happened. And we'll come back to that in a second. I'm going to bring it now, because that's something we can and should be doing today. And that's something I think we want to start doing for mining, because we see mining in a lot of science fiction. And always remember, for all of my general psychoanthropology hat, I'm here representing a mining company. And right now, mining does not have the best rep in science fiction, and yet to get the minerals that are in all of our smartphones, all of our cars, all of our buildings, all these things that we need in order to fuel the rest of the future, we are going to need some level of sustainable, really eco-friendly mining. And you get hints of that in the dystopians of science fiction, in the utopians of science fiction, whether that is on film, with things like, I don't know if everyone even remembers, Alien's a mining movie. They're a mining freighter. Does everyone remember that? Have you guys seen Alien? Yeah. Like, sometimes it's always, this is the thing about mining in particular, or industrial things in science fiction. Sometimes they're so presumed, they're like background pieces, right? They're not part of the main plot. Although Armageddon, granted, definitely the main plot, right? Let's mine an asteroid. But it's not just in movies and TV. One of the other interesting, and it's not just in books, which if everybody has an Anne McCaffrey, I highly recommend some Anne McCaffrey in your life, be it Crystal Singer or her more popular Dragon Riders of Pern, which also has some very, very cool exploration tech that has yet to be built, and which is particularly something I want to target, and we'll talk about in a second. But it's popping up more and more in video games. This is something where all of the younger generations, not even just the younger generations, all generations, are playing video games more and more. Gaming is the biggest economic industry around entertainment. It's bigger than movies, it's bigger than music. It makes more money, it pulls in more people. Be that casual gamers who are straight up doing phone games, that makes you a gamer too. Or the more elaborate kind of folks who are just diehard streamers on Twitch. There's mining embedded in most of these games, and yet it's sort of a separate conversation from everything, right? And yet it's something else that can be pulled in to be part of the conversation of what technologies do we and don't we need, and how can we target these things. And then it's worth noting, my particular favorite area of this, of when it comes up in sci-fi for mining, is the remote sensing and mineral characterization, right? Per my Anne McCaffrey note, it's the notion of, can we literally pass by a planet and completely map out in an entirely eco-friendly way just everything that's there? Can we have that? Can we know where every ore deposit is, where every ecological zone is? How do we get to that level of mapping? Because that is what most sci-fi predicates, right? They instantly know where everything is. And this is something, within my own engineering pieces and bits and bobs, we have a lot of these puzzle pieces already. We can do a one-to-one digitization of this room and really, really live annotate the hell out of everyone, and be able to use that data to extrapolate all sorts of things. We do that at scale for this planet. We do that at scale for other planets. It equals some very, very useful data for us to all be able to ethically move around and leverage things within those environments, and ensure that things are always kept balanced. But in addition to that, you also get the more traditional new drilling and extraction tools, right? This tends to be what the mining industry focuses on when they say technology, which, to be honest, is to their deficit, and something that we're trying to shift out of, because that's not the only technology they use. It's just the part of the stack that they have control over. So they've always played close to home, and this is kind of us starting to move outside and be like, hey, actually, can we talk about where the overlaps live in these other technologies we're interested in? But then you also have transportation, energy, sustainability, and terraforming. We're going to do an exercise on in a second. But let's go back to tricorders. because we had earlier the picture of the Qualcomm SpaceX challenge, right? Where they were pushing forward on the medical end of the tricorders, which still haven't quite rolled out as de rigueur for hospitals, let alone on our smartphones. So there's actually a lot of startups in the health tech space that are trying to build bits and pieces for our phones, right? That will help rapidly diagnose different things. But literally within the last couple weeks, you have a couple of fun bursts in the news of folks who are going after the mineral characterization piece. Why? Because they targeted it. They were like, hey, an X-ray fluorescence gun, this isn't enough. What else can be done to have a portable, rapid analysis tool? How can we do this? And so it's been created, and it's going to be commercialized, and it's going to roll out. Similarly, this one always gets me go, tractor beams, right? Super sci-fi flavored, to the point that while there was a lot of investment in different government spaces for tractor beams for years, people put money into tractor beams, and it was a no-go. They ran up against what they thought were the limits, and then they stopped funding it. And that's happened over and over and over with some of these topics. Essentially, in the 60s, 70s, and even in the 80s, remember, this is that earlier history slide of the government was the primary R&D driver, right? They're trying to make some of these things happen. It doesn't work out. They can't keep putting money into it, so they stop. Or at least some of them stop. Because in this instance, China didn't stop. And China, earlier this year, was like, hey, look, a tractor beam. And let the world know that they'd created, right now it's just a little miniature one, it's about this big. But it's a beam of light that moves matter. And if we've learned anything from the history of photonics, it's that you can scale that. It's one of those spaces where over and over again, they're able to do that, they're able to refine that, and often able to make it cheaper and cheaper. So while it might take us a long time to get to this level of tractor beam, of the Enterprise being sucked into a Borg ship, we may well have tractor beams sooner rather than later with respect to being able to move boxes, do transportation of goods, things along those lines. The question is, how do we get it out of, right now, the Chinese universities or the handful of US universities, British universities, I think there's one in South Africa too, that are trying to kind of figure out what they did, kind of push forward, kind of do an open exchange of the information. How does that move out of the university faster and into an entrepreneurial startup, scale-up, commercialization, enterprise good, right? That's always the challenge. But it's so crazy, right? Because it seems, you say tractor beams, it sounds so science fiction, right? And yet it's just around the corner. And that's even if nobody really fusses at it. If we all decide to fuss at it and to say, no, wait, we want to target this technology. We want to say as a collective group of industries, of government, of entrepreneurs, like we want to build something around this to move this forward faster. We can get it there faster. We can turn the 20 years it'll probably take to get commercialized into 5. And so I'd like to put to you for these last 2 examples, what do you think it would take to push forward on some of these technologies? So the first one is terraforming. So for those who are unfamiliar, terraforming is the notion of being able to, the full sci-fi version is being able to go to another planet, basically kind of retrofit the atmosphere, put in water, put in ecologically friendly environment so humans can move over there. However, if you actually abstract that, we already do terraforming on Earth all the time, right? There's already a slew of technologies that groups invest in all over the place with respect to water management. BHP itself, we pivoted about 2 years ago away from oil and gas and divested all of our things in those arenas and most of our coal to focus on potash, to focus on soil rejuvenation. Because we want to be able to ensure that the earth keeps going, right? That there's still arable land. These are pieces we're already investing in as a species. So what do we need to do to get the rest of the dominoes in place to keep going? What do we need to do to take what we're already trialing on Earth to scale it, right? To help mitigate some of the climate disaster pieces upon us and potentially transport it somewhere else. Any thoughts and ideas? I open it to the group. What popped in your head when I said terraforming? Mars?
Ash, does PHP have any interest or think tanks with regards to off-world terraforming?
Not for, I'm probably the sole think tank person there. But I think it's more focused on, right now, with respect to space mining, we're a little more interested in how we can pull aerospace technologies into the field, because there's so many beautiful patents and technologies that are created by NASA and the other space industry groups that actually only get tried out once or twice, right, for space interests, but actually could be really helpful on the ground now. And so we're actually trying to kind of focus on the reverse pipeline and on the notion of the future of mineral resource management. Because essentially the mining industry has learned the best worst practices the hard way. And we definitely want to ensure that as humanity starts moving off planet, that those best worst practices are taken into account so that future ecologies don't suffer the same things. So it's early days for us in this particular space. But in terms of where we are kind of placing some of our bets for at least on-world terraforming technologies, that is de rigueur, right? There's already a big portfolio about it. We just don't call it terraforming, right? We just usually call it our different environmental ones. Yes?
Yeah, I mean, my thought is maybe what you're saying, which is it feels to me all that's missing is vision and packaging, right? Because it's already there, to your point. It
Yeah.
exists, but no one's going to have the vision to call it
Yeah.
terraforming and bring all the bits together.
Yep. Exactly. And I think that's to our deficit, I think, because this is where storytelling becomes that important thing. I know, like 5 years ago, storytelling was like that really irritating hashtag that everyone was, the storytelling. But it's the kind of thing where stories matter, right? And I mean, this entire presentation is on the notion that stories matter so much, we should take them more seriously. So I think the reverse is true, is that I think as a collective, as sort of all the different groups, industry, government, venture, all work together, and entrepreneurs themselves all work together to push forward on the future of technology. I think we need to bear in mind our story. And I think that's part of what is collectively missing sometimes, alongside that larger like strategic push, right? We're all trying to build, but I think there's a really important mission there of we're all trying to, if we're all trying to build towards something, whether or not we want to call it a moonshot or come up with something that I think is a little more clear or a little more evocative of how achievable it is, I think the storytelling is going to matter a lot. It's a really great point.
Terraforming,
Yeah.
it's slightly systematic. It's just that we're trying to turn, another world into like our planet as an invasive kind of.
And I think when it comes to that, I think there's going to be a lot of ethical queries and concerns about that. I think it's going to have to rely a lot on our ability to really, really solidly survey other places. But I'm also always biased in favor of like the mapping tech. So I'm like, we need the good mapping tech, because we'll need to know. We'll need to know if there's anything that we're invading, because I don't think we want to repeat the Earth's history of colonization. I don't think should be as a planet then colonizing something else. I think that would be wildly inappropriate of us. I would hope that we would have learned our lesson, that it's just not the way forward.
I think you're right about the environmental restoration has been around for a long time, and in some places, for some instances, incredibly successful.
Yeah.
But it's about, this is, the people that do it, this is my thing, my gig for this place. They're not particularly good at sharing or bringing in others or looking at how does this translate into other contexts, or it just doesn't happen.
Exactly.
This silos that, how can we kind of broaden it out and have this vision and as it's strategic planning.
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on. I think the silos across the board are so dangerous, right? I think it leads to a lot of people working in a vacuum, and where they're a lot of reinvention of a wheel as well, rather than accumulation. And I think that's something that in the history of technology or the history of humanity, we often forget how many pieces of technology we've had to build to get to what we're doing now. And I think this is always really funny. Does anybody have a pen? Everybody has a pen, right? So in ancient Egypt, you might as well have been the high priest, right? Because a pen was so sacred. It was so powerful. It was so awe-inspiring piece of technology that it was like only certain people could be scribes. You had to be specially trained. You had to be specially... And it's this piece of technology that we don't even think of as technology anymore. And yet we needed the pen. We needed paper. We needed all of these things stacked up on each other cumulatively. But if we're in silos, right? If we silo what we're doing now, we're almost breaking that pattern of cumulative knowledge gathering. And I think that is something that limits us so hard. Because I think you're also right, like there's been so many amazing programs around the world to rehabilitate landscapes. And the lessons learned from there, they stay very local, don't they? As opposed to being like, hey.
Having a mechanism to
Yeah.
actually join the dots. And
Yeah.
a lot of the time that mechanism doesn't exist. Or there's a fear, or there's a, this is my space.
Yeah. It's my space, it's my funding, it becomes, or to be honest, it's my ego, right? Like it becomes these little kingdoms. And I think this is something that with the Global Entrepreneurship Congress, with kind of the future of the entrepreneurial community around the world, I think we should be working to break these concepts of silos. I think everyone coming here for this event is so amazing, to bring everyone together, to talk, to cross-pollinate, to see different ideas, to see different thoughts. I love especially that so many of the presentations are on the different methodologies of like, how do we want to shift how we're investing? How do we shift how we're partnering? Because I think we need to do that. I think we need to take a good look at our current structures of how we're deciding who to work with and what we're working on, and really shake that up. So thank you so much for bringing that up. We're winding down in time now, so I'll go to this next one. So my next example that I wanted you guys to kind of do a group shout out on is von Neumann probes. Now, a von Neumann probe is a self-replicating probe. So it's essentially, we send out a little device that's scanning the universe, or we could actually send it into the earth, maybe. There's always that potential. And it can go out, explore, and essentially when it finds the right kind of ingredients to self-print itself, it 3D prints a copy, and it programs the copy with a slightly different tweak to the mission than it had. So if the original one's going to go going this way, it built 3, and it says, you go this way, you go this way, you go this way. And then those ones go, and then they replicate, and essentially are able to explore even greater pieces of the universe farther, faster. Now here's the thing. We have many of these technologies already. This is what always gets me. We have 3D printing. We have the remote sensing. We even have the telemetry to do extreme long-distance comms. Why do you guys think we aren't doing this? What do you guys think we should do with this? Should we? Shouldn't we? How could we? Any thoughts?
I'm thinking of that theory that life on Earth came from germs and bacteria, from asteroids,
Yeah.
from outer space. And then maybe that's more plausible or possible if you look at on a smaller scale, not scale like this.
Yeah.
Because there already are patents on self-replication and technology.
Yeah.
So perhaps that is something that is really more feasible.
And that's absolutely true. There are definitely biological variations on this as well. It doesn't have to be a machine. And in fact, there's actually some very well-reputed theorists who posit that because let's be honest, statistically, there's something out there. It most likely isn't in the same time frame as us, but there was, or there will be, somewhere. The universe is huge. It's very unlikely mathematically that we're alone. And so there's a lot of interesting oomph behind the theory that somebody else's von Neumann probes are what seeded life here, is one of those theories. But again, not here to argue about origin stories, because that is always very controversial. But that is also one of the worries that people have with this, of like, would we accidentally see life somewhere else? And again, going back to Star Trek, for those of you who are Trekkies, that notion is very popular within Star Trek. There's humanoids everywhere for various reasons, and they come back around to different mythologies of why that is, that range from people kidnap people from different time periods, and that's why there's a Nazi planet, and that's why there's a cowboy planet. Like, that's how they kind of used to explain it. And then there's some more recent, more organized theories about, like, some very, very old civilizations who were just sort of spreading around as much as they could so that they could set up the universe for success. But that is, it's one of the theories of the notions, I think, that keeps us from doing this, is we're not prepared to have some of those ethical conversations. But it's the case where we do have almost every piece of technology to build this, right? And so I ask you guys, like, what other pieces of sci-fi tech have you seen? Are you like, oh my God, why don't we have this? Like, we could. Is there anything that comes to mind? Transporters. So, find out that is another area where governments used to put money into it. They really, really did. And in fact, there's a great, Michael Crichton wrote a book called Timeline, which and he's a little more famous for Jurassic Park, but I highly recommend the Timeline one because it gives you an insight into when the national labs were working on the teleporter technologies. And then the notion is they tried to make a teleporter, they actually made a time machine, is the joke. But they stopped doing that. Whether or not it would keep going if it was funded remains unclear, but at least the last chunk of research they had kind of indicated it might not work for people, but it might work for things like rocks. And gee, I wonder who might be interested in something that could teleport rocks. Maybe mining companies. And so that's really, like, it's that kind of thing, right? That was such a good, thank you so much. I feel like I planted you in the audience to, like, finish on that. Because this is where I think historically the mining industry has been very often its own corner. We've been a silo, dangerously so. And I think as we're waking up and realizing that the world shifted around us and that we're now, like, have a seat at the table on some of these technology pieces and have the funding and backing to be like, okay, well, wait, what and where and how? But also, we want to do so cautiously because it's a conservative industry. So de-risking is super important, which is why essentially, internally, externally, we're doing a lot of evangelism around this notion of if we find strategic routes, right? If we find ways to really kind of calculate, okay, what are the odds of success here or here? Then we have a potential to move forward on something like tractor beams, even though it sounds batshit crazy, arguably. Because, again, like, it's there in our universities. It's this big. Also, side note, that right around the same time the one university announced tractor beams, another university announced the Terminator medal. And I didn't include it here because it usually spurs on a bajillion and one questions that I didn't have answers for. But I highly recommend you pull up a YouTube video of it because it's a beautiful little piece of programmable metal that's inside a little cage. And they tell it to leave the cage. It smushes itself down, reorients itself, gets out of the cage, just like in Terminator 2, the policeman, like, getting out of the jail cell. And then it reconstitutes itself. Like, these beautiful and amazing things are happening in our universities. And that's even with the broken university systems we have. Imagine if we recalibrated our universities, if we recalibrated those recipes for how we get to disruptive technology that we were talking about earlier, and actually kind of moved forward on some of these things farther, faster, and made it a full pipeline, right? Rather than bit over here, bit over here, bit over here, bit over here, and then we're left to collect the dots to ourselves. Like you said, there's no dot connecting mechanism, and you see that through the technology chain as well. We need to find some way to really, really strategically say, okay, these pieces over here, let's move them, let's together move them through these different pipelines to get them out faster. And for the ones that aren't there yet, let's target those and say, well, we need that. We're going to need that. We have to, I promised that we wouldn't say it, but I will say, there's so many apocalyptic events ahead of humanity in the coming century, right? Water, soil, climate change. We're going to have to pull a full Matt Damon on Mars and The Martian. We're going to have to science our way out of it. And we're not going to be able to do that in pockets. We're not going to be able to do that in silos. And so really, this is our kind of, one of our opening volleys of, hey, we'd love to chat further on this with everybody. We'd love to partner with people on things. We'd love people to come participate in our emerging open tech challenges that we're going to be launching, because we want to see humanity thriving. We want to see the planet thriving. And there's just so much potential. But we can't all do it alone. So thank you guys so much for coming early on a Wednesday. I really appreciate it.